Morning, Mayor.
Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our council work session for January 23rd. This morning, we're going to have a little discussion about water. And I know that we've worked with water folks for many, many years on a lot of different water issues, quality of water, sources of water, our whole watershed, and looking to try to make sure we have clean water for all of our citizens at the source and also at their homes. So this morning, Mr. Manager, I'll turn it quickly over to you. Any comments that you want to make?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, we have a great partnership with the Des Moines Water Works going back many decades. We have recently, though, found opportunities to take care of an issue that is out there dealing with lead pipes with some additional funding coming from the federal government. And so with that and conversations that have been had here at the council table, we've asked Ted and his experts to come and talk with us to make sure we all understand the same science behind it, what our Des Moines situation is. And then afterwards, the staff have formulated a couple ideas for some policy changes and would like to get the council's reaction to those policy changes and see if we can't make some decisions on part of this morning. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ted and ask him to come up and get us educated on this topic. Thank you, Ted.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you a little bit here this morning about lead water service lines here in the city of Des Moines and what we might be able to do about those. Now, lead water service line replacement is a national problem. It certainly isn't just a Des Moines problem. There are communities across the country that are actively looking at what, if anything, they can do with their lead water service lines, specifically the service lines that take the water into customer homes. The Congress and EPA have kind of heightened awareness of this by providing funding. They've directed some infrastructure funding specifically at lead service lines, prioritizing disadvantaged communities across the country and asking water utilities to see what they can do to facilitate these lead water service lines being replaced. There are 20,000 roughly lead water service lines in the Des Moines Waterworks service area, and most of those, the vast majority of those, are within the corporate limits of the city of Des Moines. And so we as the Waterworks and you as the leadership here at the city of Des Moines, obviously we want to do what we can to protect public health by trying to get those replaced over a period of time. Couple key things. The takeaway, one key takeaway from this conversation today is that we do not have a lead in drinking water problem here in Des Moines. We test regularly. We have not found lead in the drinking water. We follow all the EPA regulations, state and federal requirements. We have always been in compliance with the lead and copper rule. There's not a lead in the drinking water problem, but we do have a number of lead service lines in the community, and if they're there, they can be a concern if things change or things go wrong. And so over time, it's our goal to remove those. The atmosphere in the water, the drinking water industry has long been, they're there, they're not hurting anything, just leave them, don't touch them. But frankly, after the issues that happened in Flint, Michigan, that attitude has evolved, where now the water industry is looking at, let's see what we can do to replace them. Even though they're not currently causing problem, let's see what we can do to get them out of the system and replace them with something that doesn't have that kind of potential.
Can you talk a little bit about the testing that you do, the lead and copper rule that you mentioned, and like the state regulations you were talking about?
Absolutely. There are federal regulations that are enforced by the DNR here in the state of Iowa that require certain types of treatment to ensure that the water isn't corrosive, which is what causes lead to get into the water. And then there's also requirements for sampling. And so When the lead and copper rule started, we were sampling 100 services, 100 homes every year. And then as we went through the years and we didn't find any lead, we were able to sample a smaller number. So right now we are on reduced monitoring. We're sampling in 50 homes every year for lead. And as I've said, we've always been in compliance. We see almost no lead in our system. The sampling for lead is a little bit tricky because the requirement is for a first draw sample, which means you have to take the sample at the kitchen sink before any water is used in the house on that day. And so typically, in my house, that's 5:30 in the morning, before anybody showers, before any laundry is done or anything. So you have to get in the house, take that first draw sample, and then bring it to the lab to test. So it's not something that we can do at the hose bib outside or that kind of thing. But we do regular sampling. We literally send the bottles to the home. Customers take the samples for us, bring them back in, and we test them.
Yes, and you haven't found issues in...
We've not violated the standard. The standard is fairly complex in how you have to analyze and read those samples, but we are in compliance and have always been in compliance. I just want to show this graphic because it's important to understand, first of all, that the homeowners own the entire service line in Des Moines, all the way from the water main, which is often out in the street, into their house. They own it. They're responsible for it, just like their roof or any other part of the property that they own. But the whole thing isn't lead, even in a situation where the service line was installed before 1940, which is when we can see lead pipe. The entire service line isn't lead. And on the graphic that you see in front of you, usually from the Des Moines Waterworks water main to the shutoff valve, that short piece is where the lead pipe is. Going from the shutoff valve into the home, in our case, in the older homes, is typically galvanized steel pipe, not lead. But we anticipate that the new EPA regulations are going to require the whole thing to be replaced. The lead and any galvanized steel that has ever been downstream of lead. But it's important to understand the lead pipe is just out at the street, out in the right-of-way, basically. So you can't see it coming into your house. What comes into the house is galvanized steel. It's not lead, typically. It's important to understand.
I just have a question about what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Because you said it's not just the part from the water main to the shutoff valve. It's any galvanized steel where lead may have previously flown through it. So if there are homes that have been replaced from the shutoff valve into the house, but not necessarily from the water main to the shutoff valve, those would fall under the rule too?
If it's anything that is lead or has ever been downstream from lead, we anticipate the rules are going to require that to be replaced. So if the lead part has been replaced from the water main to the shutoff valve, but there's still galvanized pipe there, but no lead, still have to replace that galvanized because at one time it was downstream from lead.
Are those captured in the 20,000, or could that be a higher number than 20,000?
Those are not captured in the 20,000, so it could be additional service line.
So does all of your pipes, the water main and all the pipes leading to the homeowner's responsibility, are any of them lead?
They're not lead.
Okay.
Most of those are cast iron, and in some cases the joints were sealed with lead, but the lead is never in contact with the water.
Right.
So there's no lead in the rest of the system.
Okay.
And we test that regularly, and we never see any lead in the system. It's just the service lines that have some lead pipe.
And that's from the shutoff valve to the home?
From the shutoff valve out to the water main.
Oh, that's all the lead is right there.
That's the only place that we've seen lead.
Okay.
It's from the water main to the shutoff valve.
Okay.
So from the pipe our pipe out in the street, basically to the sidewalk.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Is there any way for us to know the question that Josh was asking about the galvanized steel that has been downstream from lead, is there any way for us to be able to capture that or to know what homes had that work done?
There are a couple of ways, yes. They're not easy ways, but there are a couple ways. One, we're trying to work with the city to look at plumbing permit records to see if properties have pulled a plumbing permit to replace their service line. They should have done that. That's not an easy search to do. It's not something we can do on a computer. We have to go through lots of records. We can also look in the basement and see if there's copper pipe coming into the house or if it's still galvanized. And part of what we're going to recommend here to the council is a pretty intensive public information campaign, a public education campaign. And one of the things we want everybody to do is go in the basement and see what pipe they have coming in. And we literally intend to have, pictures of, hey, here's what it will look like if it's copper, and here's what it will look like if it's galvanized. And if it's galvanized, let us know. So those are the two ways that I'm aware of that we can do it. But neither one of those are easy.
So if the line was to be replaced and you replace the whole line, it would be replaced with copper?
Yes.
Okay.
That's our plan. There are other options, but that's what we're...
Are there risks associated with copper?
No. Well, I shouldn't say no. There are risks if you have highly corrosive water, but again, we don't. The rule that governs lead service lines is literally called the lead and copper rule. You have to test for lead and copper. It's much less common to see copper corrosion. Copper is much more stable than lead. So it would be incorrect of me to say there are never any risks, but copper is the standard in the industry, and we see no problems in Des Moines with copper pipe, and the industry sees very, very few problems. It's a good material.
So it would be a higher corrosiveness of the water for it to be a problem with copper than with lead?
Yes, and a different kind of corrosiveness that is less common and should not be an issue.
Can you talk a little bit about how you guarantee the water doesn't become corrosive?
We treat the water very carefully at Des Moines Water Works. We've used the same process for decades, and there are a couple of measurements that we can use to determine how corrosive the water is, and both of them take into consideration a lot of factors in the water chemistry, the pH being the most important. But we monitor that on a daily basis, and we make sure that the water isn't corrosive when it leaves the plant. That's something we do every single day, and so we're confident that when the water leaves the plant, it's not corrosive. It would be very unusual for it to become corrosive out in the system, but I think your question was about how we make sure that the water we send out is not corrosive. Mm-hmm. And it's basically a water chemistry question, and we manage that and monitor it every day.
Because when there are problems with like water becoming corrosive and lead in the water, it's because it was corrosive at the plant. There was something done wrong, right?
The ones that are the most notable, like in Flint, Michigan, the water was leaving the plant. And the chemistry wasn't right, mm-hmm. and that was the problem. But we monitor that and have been successfully doing it for many, many years, and don't plan to change anything. So shouldn't have a problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. So presumably, if a line has been replaced by a homeowner, it's going to be a copper line now?
Yes, presumably.
Now, would you still need to, based on the rule, replace that copper line if there's a lead service line upstream?
No. So it's commonplace in Des Moines for that galvanized steel to leak after 50, 60, 70 years. And so it's not uncommon to see that the galvanized is replaced from the shutoff valve at the sidewalk into the house. And that would have been replaced with copper. There are other options, but let's just say either copper or PEX, which is a plastic. And sometimes they do leave that lead there. It's allowed, or it was allowed. You could leave it there. Now, if we go back to replace the lead and we find that there's copper from the shutoff valve into the house, that's okay. We don't have to replace that. Because galvanized pipe, when it gets old, it gets very rough on the inside, and the fear is that little chunks of lead might have gotten caught in the roughness on the inside of the pipe. and then be laying there and have the potential to contribute lead. Copper doesn't get rough on the inside. To the point earlier, it really, we don't have a corrosion problem with copper. And so the rule doesn't require that to be replaced. Once it's copper, it's good. And even if it's been downstream of lead, it's still good. Well, next here. So, lead service line replacement in the city of Des Moines is really a community problem. I mean, the city of Des Moines doesn't own these service lines. You know, we don't own them as the waterworks. The homeowners own them, but it can be a $10,000 bill to replace a service line. And let's face it, nobody's saving money for a shiny new water service line, right? Most people don't even think about it unless it leaks. One of the things that we'd really like to do is approach this problem holistically. Let's look at the whole problem, and let's see how we can get all of the service lines replaced over the next 15 years or so. There is federal funding available right now. It's not nearly enough. 20,000 service lines, $10,000 a piece. That's a $200 million problem just here in the city of Des Moines. The funding that the state of Iowa is going to receive, $45 million over the next 5 years, is just barely enough to handle Des Moines, and I can assure you we're not going to get it all. So we are going to go after that funding, but we also need to look for other ways to find funding, because we'd really like to make funds available for customers who just can't afford it, you know, who are in a disadvantaged situation, or maybe the home value isn't high enough to support a $10,000 repair. So that's the first thing that we want to do is look for sources of funding. We want to work collaboratively with the city to do that, see if we can pull grants to the city of Des Moines, if we can get as much federal funding as possible. If we can lobby for additional federal funding to the lead service line program nationally, those are all things that we could do together as the waterworks and the city.
And I take it the insurance that you can get for the sewer or the water line doesn't cover the replacement for this.
If the line leaks,
Yeah,
they'll replace it.
right.
But what it won't cover is a new rule from the EPA that says they all have to be replaced.
Okay.
The day that rule passes, they're not going to replace all 20,000 of them for us, unfortunately. We've had that conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
And that is explicitly excluded from the contract that we have with them. But if it leaks, they replace it. You know, so we get rid of a few of them that way, but not all. So our vision is that...
Sorry, before you go on, how soon is the federal funding going to be available? Do you know?
That's a great question. I think the state already has the funding, but DNR is working on a couple of questions. One, they are defining disadvantaged communities where the funds can be used, and they're literally going to give us a map of the census tracts in Des Moines that will qualify for the funding. And then they're also still working on how they're going to issue the funding. They're going to do it through the SRF program, the State Revolving Loan Fund program, but they don't know yet whether it's going to be as grants, likely not. More likely it's going to be partially forgivable loans, but they haven't decided how much is going to be forgivable yet, whether half or 30% or just exactly how that's going to work. So we're hoping that by the 1st of March, they'll have answers to those questions. We hope to submit an application for funding to them on the 1st of March, but we haven't heard from them yet.
And so, and after, if they're ready on the 1st of March and you submit an application, do you know how long that would take before the money is able to go out the door?
I don't know exactly. It's still our goal to start replacing some service lines this year, but not knowing and not having answers to their questions, it's difficult for me to say that that's going to happen for sure, but that's our goal.
Okay, thank you.
So it's our vision that we would try to collect this money and create a pool. We would actually issue a contract that we would oversee and manage for service lines to be replaced in these areas that the DNR identifies as eligible for the federal funding. We'd work closely with the city, figure out, how are we going to roll this thing out through city construction projects, Des Moines Waterworks construction projects. As we start to touch these things, we want to get them replaced. We don't want to leave them in the ground anymore. And then we also want to launch a pretty robust joint PR campaign to help people understand that, hey, you have a lead service line. A lot of people don't even know that they have a lead service line, even though there's a map on our website. We've talked about it several times, but we want to make sure that people do know. There's certainly people in the community who have the means to replace their service line if they find out it's lead, and they may well want to do that. And there's no sense waiting or holding them up. So we want to work together through our channels, through your channels, to get all of that out, that information out to the community. Oops. So here's kind of a summary of what we're recommending overall. We want to work together to try to find this funding. We're working right now with the DNR on the federal funding, but we would like to work with the city to find other sources of funding that we can put in this pot that will allow us to replace lead service lines. We want to collaborate on that community outreach and education, facilitating replacement in these disadvantaged areas that are identified by DNR and eligible for the funding, but also encouraging replacement citywide. You know, there are people who may want to replace their own service line if they recognize that it's lead, and the fact of the matter is there's never going to be enough funding to replace them all, so some are going to have to be replaced by the property owners. And then we'd also like to work with the council on to consider possible policy solutions, and we don't know what those look like, but there are different things happening across the country. Time of transfer sort of requirements are happening in some areas. Date certain replacement requirements where customers are just given the opportunity to do this over a period of time, but it has to be done by 5 years from now, as an example, and other things. That's really kind of your realm, but we'd really like to work with the council on ideas there of what could be done. So that is the presentation. I've got Jenny Puffer here with me today, who facilitates. She's the director of water distribution. She's our construction expert, and Amy Kaler is here. She's our CFO. She can answer financial questions better than I can, but happy to answer whatever questions.
Where's the map listed on your website? What's that under?
I could get there pretty quickly, but
Yeah, there's no.
on lead service lines.
I just want to bring up, when you brought up when we met about older apartment buildings,
Yes.
if they're large enough, they never had lead pipe.
That's right. We do see 4 flats that have a lead service line, but if you get much bigger than that, usually they had a 2-inch line, and 2-inch lines in Des Moines were never lead. And so if you have an 8 or 10 or 12 unit apartment building, even if it was built before 1940, which is kind of the vintage we're talking about here, chances are it does not have a lead line, but smaller ones could.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's interesting.
Mr. Manager?
Yeah, thank you. And essentially, I wanted to dive into the potential recommendations from staff and
I have a question for them. So one of the things you sort of touched on were some potential data needs.
Mm-hmm.
Could you help me understand that better? I mean, one of the things that sounded like a focus of an education campaign might be, and Scott, maybe you're going to get to this, but was what is in the home, or if there have been changes made, and so that would be maybe a high-level data need that there could be some facilitation of.
Right. We've worked with the city a little bit already on this question of, okay, there's a house that was built in the 20s. It has a new tap, but does it have a new service line all the way in? We don't know. So we're trying to find these, plumbing data. I don't know that that's available, readily available. What we've heard is it's probably, a microfilm sort of a search. So have service lines been replaced at the addresses that we're aware of that at one time probably had a lead service line? That's a data need. That's probably the biggest one I can think of right now off the top of my head. Were there others that you had in mind, or?
Wait, well, so plumbing needs, I mean, you said, I mean, I don't know that you'd want the picture, but you'd want the homeowner to identify. I mean, so pictures of the pipe coming in might be a...
That's something that other cities around the country have done, is literally sent pictures out that said, hey, this is what copper looks like coming into your home. this is what galvanized pipe looks like coming into your home. Let us know which one you have. And then for the people who report they have galvanized, we can inspect it and confirm or deny that they still have galvanized pipe coming into the house. If they do, there's an extremely high probability that at one time that galvanized was downstream from lead and it will have to be replaced. But that, I don't know that that's as much of a data need as it's a tactic that we may use to get the information that we need.
Anybody have any more questions? I'd like to turn it over to the manager. Okay, thank
Just
you.
for clarification, replacement software platform, would that be analyzing the plumbing records and putting that into a software platform, or what is that?
The software platform that we need is one that helps us track all this information that we're going to collect. I mean, we have the information on what the tap size was and what the date was, and we need to input that all into some database that's easier to search and sort. And then as we get information back from homeowners about what they see in their basement or those kind of things, or as we get information from plumbing permits, we have to have a central place to put that all.
Okay.
But also, and maybe more importantly, we need software that will help us take all of that information and put it into EPA's required inventory reporting tool. Because right now, that's a kind of a manual entry tool. And there are software platforms out there that will help facilitate that, and then will also help facilitate, the construction and bidding and replacement and moving this whole process forward.
Do you know roughly how much that would cost, or how much?
$200,000 to $400,000.
Ted, do you know when properties are sold and some lenders require a home inspection, do you know if any of those inspectors are yet noting anything about the water supply line?
I don't know. I'm not aware that they are. My experience is very limited in that regard, but it's not something that I'm aware is on their list, and I'm not aware that it's on any kind of disclosure list when a home is sold.
Is it something that, if that was included, I guess that would be voluntarily, but or that lenders would require just as a checklist or checkbox on a list?
Right.
Would that help identify properties?
I don't think it would help identify the properties because they'd probably have to ask us, does it have a lead service line? Or maybe they could look in the basement to see if there's galvanized down there. Maybe that could be something we require them to look at when the home transfers, just what kind of pipe is coming into the house. So it might help in that regard.
So like in the transfer, if a home was being inspected, could the inspection company inquire with you what record you had on that property?
Absolutely.
As far as the most current replacement, if it had been replaced.
They could inquire from us about what the tap date was and the size, the connection to our water system. We could give them that information. But they could also very reliably look at the piping coming into the home and understand what it is and document that.
And so you said it's going to take the whole community to do that. So, I mean, is there any way that we could encourage adding that checkbox? I mean, just like some inspectors require a radon inspection.
Mm-hmm.
That probably didn't happen 10 or 20 years ago. So,
right. I think that would be great. And, that's the kind of thing we can learn from the council is just how we can facilitate that. But I think getting lead service line on the list of considerations at the time of transfer for homes, just like radon is on the list, would be a positive step forward.
But a seller's disclosure just has to say,
yeah.
Are you aware? And you would just check the unknown box, because I, as a homeowner, wouldn't have any idea. You wouldn't know whether it
Sure.
was. A lender's not going to require any kind of inspection unless it's an FHA, a federally backed loan. Then FHA would require a FHA appraiser to come out, but he's just looking to see that there's no peeling paint, there's stair railings. Nobody's looking at that because nobody would have that knowledge. Just like radon is not required. If I know that I have radon, I have to disclose it. But it's, as a buyer, I don't have to have a radon test if I don't want to. And the bank is not going to.
They don't at this time.
Pardon me?
They don't at this time.
At this
Require it.
time.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Correct.
everything's at this time, but it's not required.
All right.
Mayor, if I
Are
could?
you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, all right. Jump in.
All right, well, I appreciate all the questions because it's helping us understand this. There's a lot of different angles that we could take on this from the city. Obviously, we've already been collaborating with Des Moines Waterworks, and Polk County's been at that table as well. We're going to continue to do that unless I hear otherwise. But I would like to be able to lean forward with council's permission on some of these ideas that have been discussed this morning. That may include staff time looking at our building permit records to assist, understanding if there's opportunities to share in individual property requests that potentially would come in with records from either Waterworks or the city. Another effort that we've been talking about is as we are in the street with CIP projects doing work, we may come to you with an opportunity to replace some of these pipes at the same time that we're doing work in the street. It seems like that might make sense as well. So unless I hear otherwise, we're going to continue down that path of identifying where those opportunities would make sense. Obviously, on a street where there's older, older homes. I think the other question for you guys is, I would like to also submit that in discussions with the DNR and the funding that the state has for this effort, that we would be willing at the city level to assist in individual homeowner income testing so that they don't have to look just at the census tract to qualify or disqualify entire swaths of our community. It seems like they're doing that from a simplicity or an efficiency standpoint at the state level, just to say, okay, this census tract is going to qualify, but these won't. Obviously, we know that our city has grown at different times, and the location of these high-risk properties, higher-risk properties, are throughout our entire community, and they will not necessarily fall in the same. They won't fall in the same census tracts and may not all get qualified. And yet, with a little effort on our part, we could say we have several low-income homes that could utilize this state funding if we spent the time to do the income testing that we already do in other instances with other programming that the city offers. So I can provide more information on that effort, but just know that we're going to lean forward on getting as many homeowners qualified for this state funding as possible, including spending some of our own staff time. There are questions that have already been asked of the council, asked of staff, looking at the legality of some of these changes. And I appreciate that the legal department has already dove into this to start to get a better feel for what is possible. And so from a policy standpoint, Jeff, I don't know if you want an overarching comment or two, but with what you've provided in writing to me is that it's clear that we could implement some policy changes, especially in the rental home scenario. And it seems like that would be appropriate. So the first question I have of council is this morning, can we focus possibly on rental properties and go after some solutions for those? And then maybe come back with the owner-occupied options once we have answers from the DNR and where that funding may be available. Is that agreeable?
I think that's the way, yeah.
I'm fine with focusing on rental. I just wanted to ask a question really quickly. Were you talking about time of transfer requirements? Did you bring that up, or was that?
That seems more appropriate on the owner-occupied discussion, but we would obviously be willing to utilize staff time to help research
Okay.
what the
It's something that you're
answer
looking
is.
into.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So if we go down the path of the rental, one of the things that we believe we can do is actually require that in order to have a rental certificate at some point in time, you have to have either verified that you don't have lead pipe or even the galvanized pipe that was downstream, or you've actually taken the time or you've actually replaced the lead pipe such that it does no longer exist.
Most likely affordable housing to spend $10,000 to dig up their street, to put in a new line, because that's just going to, I mean, it's going to raise rents. And I think what Mr. Corrigan is saying is, let's look at it holistically. When we're there digging up a street, we could replace all of them at once and have some sort of cost share maybe with the homeowners. But, I mean, he's even said, what I heard at the last council meeting was, well, let's test it. If it tests high, then it has to be replaced. But testing it is probably not going to show that there's lead in the drinking water.
That's
So
right.
are you saying if you have a lead service line, it's got to be replaced regardless whether you test positive or negative for lead in the water?
That is an option. I don't want to confuse the effort here. We agree, the city, or at least myself, city manager, in discussions with the waterworks, that this effort should be to replace all lead pipes eventually. The question is, how aggressive do we want to do that, and what timeline would we want to address it?
I was going to say for the rental, I think I'm in agreement that I think if you do have a rental property where you're earning money, that you should take the responsibility to, if this is our focus is to get rid of them, then over a timeline, I'm not saying it's going to happen, you have to do it this year, but within a timeline specification that you need to replace those lines. If they are affordable housing and the owner that possibly lives out of state doesn't want to live in Des Moines, maybe they end up putting it back on the market and it's being able to be redone and a person can buy an affordable house. So as far as a rental property, I think we do need a timeline and some type of ordinance that does stipulate that they do need to disclose it. When they sell it, it needs to be replaced or whatever has to be. I do think we could do something in the rental area.
I did want to ask, based on what Connie's bringing up, do we have any idea of what that timeline would be? And also, how we've been talking about time of transfer for rental properties, like requiring that if it sells, that it needs to be replaced at the time of sale.
It's going to, I believe it may be easier to utilize the rental certificate as the requirement as opposed to the point of sale. The point of sale is going to be more appropriate when we talk about owner occupied. And so if we focus on the rental, the question of the timeline is really, again, up to the council as far as how aggressive to be. My recommendation would be 5 to maybe 8 years. Understanding that that's a lot of work that would need to get done if it's anything shorter than that.
Are you talking about for the rentals? Because they get
Just the rentals.
They get a certificate every 1 to 3 years, correct?
Yes, based on their performance.
Do you have a list of all the properties that have lead pipe that do we have that list?
What we have, to be clear, is a list of all of the properties that have half-inch taps, half-inch connections. We believe that those are 99% of those have lead.
Okay.
There are a few where if that tap was replaced and they left the galvanized in the ground and we don't know that, there could be a few. We don't have a list of those yet. You know, we're going to have to work on that through cooperation with the city and public outreach. But the 20,000 is half-inch taps, and we believe that those all have lead pipe.
And that's the list you have on your website. Those are individual addresses, correct? That those dots are.
Yes, they are. And we have a list of individual addresses, and we have shared that with city staff, and they've compared that to the rental certificate list. I think there's about 2,000 overlap.
Well, I think that I could just say, I think there should be a lot more discussion. I think we should hear some landlords. It bothers me to hear some misconceptions. When I hear council members say, well, the landlords live out of state. There are many, many landlords that live right here in Des Moines that have rental properties, and to have it be said, well, the landlords are making money. I think if you'll visit with true landlords, not very many landlords make very much money. It's just simply they're providing some housing at an affordable rate. And I think Home Inc. will agree with that. But to make some statements that are being said are just simply not true.
So I have a question, because in your policy recommendations, you said date certain replacement requirements. And so in the context of the rental properties, I assume that's what you're talking about, what Councilmember Bozen suggested, maybe over a period of time, giving whether it be 3 or 4 rental certificate cycles so that they have lead time. That's the type of policy recommendation when you say date certain replacement that we're talking about.
It is. There are examples of date certain requirements across the country where a city is giving everyone a date certain requirement because they have to get rid of not just rentals, but owner occupied also. And so that's why it's on the list, is because it's an option that we've seen being used in other places. Our goal is to replace them all. And that's where we want to focus our efforts, is replacement, as opposed to testing or, I don't know, those are probably the 2 options. But yeah, we are focused on getting them all.
Yeah.
Mr. Attorney?
Yeah, I just want to make clear that the manager had asked us to look into rental authority. The comment just now about the point of sale for owner occupied, we have not researched that. We've actually been preempted by the state with respect to contract sales on point of sale conditions. So we'll have to look at that to see whether or not that's even a possibility. So I just wanted to draw that distinction.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, I think the focus on rental is appropriate. And I agree with Councilmember Bozen that I think we should come up with a date certain in terms of the amount of lead time that we want to give. You know, I think somewhere in the 5 to 10 year range is appropriate, and work to get these all replaced. I do, on the point of sale question. So for example, if we said, okay, in the next 8 years, this has to be done, and someone sold their rental to another renter, I assume we could, to avoid sort of getting around an 8-year window or something along those lines, we could make sure that if there was point of sale in between that now and that 8-year period for rental to rental, we could do something.
I would have a lot of faith, to be honest with you, as investor properties, that if we put this in place, anybody buying single-family homes for investment purposes, for rental, is going to require the seller to tell them and notify them if they have. So I have a lot of faith that when you have something like this in place, the smart investors are going to make sure they know when they're buying that property whether or not it's got the lead pipe.
So what I hear you guys saying is they can go through a couple cycles and still get a certificate. But I would probably take it a step further and make sure before we give them another certificate, they need to test and make sure that there's not a problem in the home. Because if there is, they should not get a rental certificate. If we're going to do this, we're doing it for the safety of these residents. I don't feel comfortable if we're going to put a policy in place to just let it slide for 8 more years or 5 to 8 more years, and knowing that they should be testing each time we we give them a rental certificate if we're not going to require them to do it on the first time you get a rental certificate renewal. So, I mean, is that what we're thinking, or we're just gonna just let it slide until the 8 years is up and you haven't did it yet, so now you don't get a rental certificate and you have to do that? That seems a little counterproductive.
So what we've realized is we've heard this morning is there's more challenges to the testing than we thought.
Okay.
And so the logistics of getting a confident test done by a landlord that has to enter the property and for that first test of the morning and provide that sample in a custody situation so that we know it's confidently not being manipulated involves a lot of logistics. So frankly, what we've always had available, Des Moines Waterworks has always made available, is if a tenant had thought they had concerns, they could get tested. That remains. The educational piece would likely alert more people of that concern. We could go as far as alerting every property that we're aware of that may have the lead pipes. I just think that's going to be a better approach at this point. There's no change in the risk analysis from lead being in the water. Okay, so we just know it's just not, the construction we want to see. We want to get that replaced. But there's been no change.
Well, if there's no risk, then why are we doing anything?
I'm not saying no risk. There's not been change in that risk scenario. The Waterworks hasn't changed any of their procedures.
I mean,
But it's not a risk.
I
It's a potential
understand
to be.
what you're saying, that the chain of testing and going
Yeah.
through that process, but if we're going to do it, then we need to do it and do the whole thing. And listen, you don't get a grace period if you're testing for lead. We need to replace the pipe immediately, or else just leave it alone and go through wait for the grants and partner with them and do that. I mean, if we're going to do it through the rental process, I mean, then we should require that portion of it if you get a renewal. That something needs to be, or change it immediately if you don't get the test. And that needs to be part of our renewal.
What about from a notification perspective? Or maybe require notification to the tenant so that, and then if the tenant opts for testing, it's a requirement of the landlord to pay for that test.
Not the tests were free, or are they free?
They
But
might not.
only,
If we had a regulation, it would be $18 a test.
or is it
What I was-
$18? But in the landlord.
Right now, we offer free testing to any homeowner who has potential for having a lead service line. If there's a requirement that thousands of landlords test every year, that likely isn't going to be free.
Yes, it'd be $18.
It'd be $18.
Well, I mean, then the landlord would need to pay $18.
Right.
So, Joe, is what you're proposing essentially that we have this grace period, but that if there is if they test for lead, then they don't get the grace, essentially, and the landlord would pay for the test, and there would be notification to the tenant.
Yeah, I mean, legally, we can require them to pay for the test, correct, Mr.
We
Lester?
think so, yeah.
I mean, if we're going to do this, then, I mean, that's the appropriate way. I mean, you can't just keep giving certificates just because we've set a drop dead date of this is when it needs to be replaced. We're doing it, if this is why we're doing it, is for the safety of the people living there, then, yeah, I believe that's what we need to do. And that's just.
I mean, that makes sense.
I mean, that's kind of common sense.
I think we're all in agreement there if it
It's
was
a
a
tough-
simple process. But we are talking about a testing process that is far from simple.
Well, I mean,
And-
they have to produce a bottle of water. If they don't do it correctly, that's not on us. We've asked them to test. I mean, if they don't go get the water before it comes out and they give you water in the middle of the day, Well, I guess they gave them water in the middle of the day. I mean, there's not much we can do about that.
We can try to work on like the notification requirement, the landlord providing the test to the tenant, and then,
Why don't we let staff go through it? If you, Scott, and your staff want to come back with some recommendations on timeline options based on what we legally can do, because there's a lot of, to me, if they get a certificate and it's a 3-year time frame, do they have to do it at that end of that or before they get the new one? Because there's going to be that rolling time. So if you
get 2 certificates.
that's, I'm just saying, give us a couple options to look at what we think is reasonable. But still have the same goal in mind. What you're trying to do is to get rid of the lines that could potentially be an issue. And I think that's the big thing. We have to make sure people understand that water is safe right now.
Yes.
It's the potential that we know this could come down the line, that it's in the best for everyone, right?
Yes.
To get it changed.
but should tragedy strike and Ted and the entire waterworks team is gone and they decide to change things overnight, we don't want to have the problem sitting there waiting.
Can Chris Johansson tell us how many homes built before 1920 have rental certificates? Because we're not talking 20,000. We're
A couple thousand.
We're talking
Less than
2,000.
a couple thousand.
2,000.
Before 1940.
Or 1940. I'm
There's like a
sorry,
couple
for
thousand, I think.
1940.
Yeah, I think it's 2,500 is the number.
2,500
with rental
rentals.
certificates. Yeah.
But that would also not include the bigger buildings that didn't even have an issue, right?
Right,
Okay.
right.
So it's single-family duplex, quads at most?
Yeah.
It's the match of out of the 20,000 number, how many have rental certificates, and that's 2,500.
2,500.
And that's one line for each property?
Carl's got his hand up here.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Ted, it would be great if, talking with your colleagues in other water-producing districts, if they're struggling with this same issue, what you're hearing as answers. We don't have to do a one-off, this is the way Des Moines does it, but if you hear what other communities are doing, that'd be terrific.
Yeah, we're continuing to research that, and we will certainly share that with city staff, other, options that we see. The time of transfer and the date certain are things that we have seen, and so that's why they were on the list. But I'm sure we will come across other things as this federal funding rolls out and communities start doing this across the country, and we'd be happy to share that information with staff and bring further proposals to the council.
So question, would the grants be available to the landlords or only owner-occupied properties? I guess I don't know.
The
how-
federal funding does not distinguish between owner-occupied or rental. It just distinguishes between disadvantaged and not.
So if it's in the census tract, then the landlord actually would be able to get the grant.
That's what we think the direction is going to be, but we're still waiting for DNR to tell us the exact story. But our understanding is it's going to be based on census tract, and anything in there is eligible, as long as it has a lead service line and it's in there. It's eligible for the
That
federal
makes
funding.
sense.
That
Then
would be-
then I would require them to test and fix it immediately then, if we have an issue.
Are we able to get more specific with the, are we able to, DNR is going to set a standard, but are we able to be more specific than that standard with our income testing that you were bringing up?
Yeah, I brought that up so that we would have a way to assist property owners that don't fall in the
Like outside
census
of the-
tracts.
yeah.
Right. That to ask that if we do the work to verify that this is a low-income household, could we not qualify them for the same state funding?
Do we know that like DNR is not going to have like a block to that or something like that?
We don't know at this time.
You don't know, yeah.
We don't know. My guess, frankly, is that they're going to say, we identify the census tracts and you got to be in there. And we can work with them on that. We can all work with them on that, the city and the waterworks. But my guess is they're going to identify the areas and want us to stay in those areas with the federal fund. Now, our goal is to gather other funds, other grants, other programs, to lobby for additional federal funding and for it to be less restrictive. And I think that that's going to happen because this is happening all over the country. I think we'll see more funding. We're just trying to get started here and do what we can, and with a goal of replacement.
Yeah.
And I think that this makes sense. I'm open to the approach that Joe suggested. I mean, I'm a little, the testing piece in the context, I mean, I think it makes sense, but I also understand that everything should be fine and there's maybe not as much value in the testing. The real goal is the replacement and making sure that a rental property is safe between now and when we get the replacement done seems reasonable to me. So I'm okay with that type of approach. I probably have some flexibility there, but whatever we can get support for to keep the replacement date certain piece moving, I'm going to be good with.
Then I think I've got enough direction to bring back some language to council to consider. And I really appreciate all the assistance from the Waterworks because we'll be vetting that language through them as well before.
Yeah, you're going to work with,
Yes.
you guys are going to work together to
Absolutely.
do that language together.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time on this important issue.
All right, we've got a meeting at 3 o'clock today, a closed session. So council, we'll see you there, and regular meeting will start about 10 minutes to 5. So thank you all for your attendance, and we'll see you this evening. Meeting's adjourned.